Hey, thanks for tuning back in to this episode of Genuine Questions. And as I said in the last episode, it's hard to know the truth about what's going on in the world with so much information, and it's hard to know who to believe and who not to believe. So to me, I think it is important to judge the credibility of the sources of this information that we are receiving. And one of the things that I say a lot too is it's okay to not have an opinion on every single topic. If there's something going on and I haven't looked into it that much and I don't know both sides of the issue, I'm fine saying that I don't know enough to have an opinion on something. So when I do have an opinion on something, I want to make sure that I've looked at all sides and I am capable of articulating how I arrived at the conclusion that I did. Even if it is wrong, I would like people to understand this is why I think that, and it's not just some crazy crackpot conspiracy. And I want to look at all sides of the argument, so I'm not dismissing something as a crazy conspiracy without even at least knowing why people think that. And it was a big mistake for the government to give me 2 months off work last year and all the time in the world to investigate and form an opinion on Bill Gates. I never gave him much thought before last year or realized what his level of influence was, but I have now, and this video is going to go over why I have come to the conclusion that he is an evil man with very sinister motives. And there's a lot of stuff out there about Bill Gates. I'm not going to be able to cover everything, so there's plenty more if you want to go look into it. But I think these topics alone are enough to make me side-eye the heck out of this MFer. And, of course, the media who fawns over him while tripping over themselves to defend this guy for no reason. If you remember, before he started the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and became a global philanthropist, Bill Gates was sued by the United States government with Microsoft for his greedy, corrupt, monopolistic business practices. Just a few short years after that lawsuit, he rehabbed his image by creating the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. If you're looking at this from the left perspective and we want to eat the rich, Bill Gates should be the main course. Not only is he the richest or second richest person on the planet and has a wide influence on almost every aspect of our lives, but he has no medical degree and he's allowed to be the authority on our public health practices. There are many examples of nefarious organizations that hide in plain sight, and typically they do so by having their public mission be something that's really altruistic so they can avoid suspicion and public scrutiny. Couple examples of this are, at one point, the president of the Amber Alert system was actually a woman who was convicted of human trafficking. The president of the children's charity UNICEF, he was arrested in, it was either 2014, but I think 2016, and he was keeping 2 underage kids as sex slaves while he was publicly running the #1 global children's charity event. You also have things like the Clinton Foundation that say that they are out there doing good works across the globe. It's very vague, but when you look into it, it seems that it was a way to buy and sell influence. So this is not unheard of, and I think it's worth looking into on whether the richest or second richest man in the world's foundation is also one of these nefarious organizations that's hiding in plain sight. So we're going to start by watching this montage that I made of Bill Gates dismissing these accusations into his motivations as absurd conspiracies. And you're going to notice the following. The journalists always frame these questions in the most absurd way that they possibly can. Just, oh, are you microchipping people so you can track their movements and follow them around? So they always take the most fringe, crazy conspiracy and present that to him as though that's the only thing that people are saying about him. Bill Gates is always going to act like he has no idea where these accusations are coming from and just sort of mocks them as absurd without offering any sort of explanation or counter argument to these actions that they are criticizing. And then he's going to advocate that social media companies need to do a better job of prohibiting people from criticizing him and questioning his motivations.
Through his foundation, the billionaire has committed at least $1.75 billion to the global response to the health crisis. He's baffled by the claims that he and Fauci created the pandemic to try to control people and that they wanted to use vaccines to insert trackable microchips into people.
No, Bill Gates is not putting chips into the vaccine so that when it injects into you, we could follow you around. I mean, come on, let's get serious about that.
You know, nobody would have predicted that I and Dr. Fauci would be so prominent in, really kind of evil theories about, did we create the pandemic? Are we trying to profit from it? And on and on. This percentage that's really misled by these conspiracy theories, it's unclear to me. There's millions of messages out there, where my name or Dr. Fauci's name is used, but do people really believe that stuff? We're going to have to get educated about this over the next year and understand, how does it change people's behavior? How should we have minimized this, either, working with the social media companies or explaining what we were up to in a better way?
You have been the subject of a disinformation campaign. In fact, the posts on social media about you and coronavirus are considered the most widespread coronavirus falsehoods that exist. So I want to address some of them. To be clear, do you want a vaccine so that you can implant microchips into people?
No, there's no connection between any of these vaccines and any tracking type thing at all. I don't know where that came from.
Does Facebook have a responsibility to do more in terms of shutting down this misinformation?
Yeah, well, they are willing to get rid of anti-vaccination messages that are, false there. But the conspiracy theories, they, are starting to step up on, and we feel like we have a good dialogue with them about how to do that.
Since Bill Gates has no idea where people got these ideas from, and the journalists asked no follow-up questions, I will be happy to explain it to everybody. So first, we'll talk about the microchips. Bill Gates says in a TED Talk that people will need digital immunity proof so they can identify who's vaccinated. I have no idea why, but TED Talk actually deleted that sentence from their video of the TED Talk. But fortunately, they forgot to do it in the audio-only version. So we are going to watch this video now where you can hear him talk about digital immunity proof.
What we'll have to have is certificates of who's a recovered person, who's a vaccinated person, because you don't want people moving around the world where you'll have some countries that won't have it under control. Sadly, you don't want to completely block off the ability for those, people to go there and come back and move around. So eventually there will be sort of this digital immunity proof that, will help facilitate the global reopening up.
This idea has been talked about for years. The World Economic Forum mentioned it in 2018 as a way to use biometrics to enhance global travel security. You might remember the Rockefeller family from the video on World War II and all of the people that were fascists who weren't held accountable during World War II. Their foundation did an exercise where they envisioned what global government control would look like in the future. And there were 4 different scenarios which they were adamant were just predictions. And they included potential news headlines. But they were adamant that if any of this stuff ended up happening in the future, it would strictly be a coincidence. So I just want to read to you a few portions of one of their imagined scenarios, which was called the Lockstep Scenario. In 2012, the pandemic that the world had been anticipating for years finally hit. Unlike 2009's H1N1, this new influenza strain was extremely deadly. Even the most pandemic-prepared nations were quickly overwhelmed when the virus streaked around the world, infecting nearly 20% of the global population and killing 8 million in just 7 months, the majority of them healthy young adults. The pandemic also had a deadly effect on economies. International mobility of both people and goods screeched to a halt, breaking global supply chains. Even locally, normally bustling shops and office buildings sat empty for months, devoid of both employers and customers. The United States' initial policy of strongly discouraging citizens from flying proven deadly in its leniency, accelerating the spread of the virus not just within the U.S., but across borders. However, a few countries did fare better, China in particular. The Chinese government's quick imposition and enforcement of mandatory quarantine for all citizens, as well as its instant and near hermetic sealing off of all borders, saved millions of lives, stopping the spread of the virus far earlier than in other countries and enabling a swifter post-pandemic recovery. China's government was not the only one that took extreme measures to protect its citizens from risk and exposure. During the pandemic, national leaders around the world flexed their authority and imposed airtight rules and restrictions, from the mandatory wearing of face masks to body temperature checks at entries to communal spaces like train stations and supermarkets. Even after the pandemic faded, this more authoritarian control and oversight of citizens and their activities stuck and even intensified. In order to protect themselves from the spread of increasingly global problems, from pandemics and transnational terrorism to environmental crises and rising poverty, leaders around the world took a firmer grip on power. At first, the notion of a more controlled world gained wide acceptance and approval. Citizens willingly gave up some of their sovereignty and their privacy to more paternalistic states in exchange for greater safety and stability. Citizens were more tolerant and even eager for top-down direction and oversight, and national leaders had more latitude to impose order in the ways they saw fit. In developed countries, this heightened oversight took many forms. Biometric IDs for all citizens, for example, and tighter regulations of key industries whose stability was deemed vital to national interest. But more authoritarian leadership worked less well, and in some cases tragically, in countries run by irresponsible elites who used their power to pursue their own interests at the expense of their citizens. Wherever national interests clashed with individual interests, there was conflict. Sporadic pushback became increasingly organized and coordinated as disaffected youth and people who had seen their status and opportunity slip away, largely in developing countries, incited civil unrest. In 2026, protesters in Nigeria brought down the government, fed up with entrenched cronyism and corruption. Even those who liked the greater stability and predictability of this world began to grow uncomfortable and constrained by so many tight rules and by the strictness of national boundaries. The feeling lingered that sooner or later, something would inevitably upset the neat order that the world's governments had worked so hard to establish. Technological innovation in Lockstep is largely driven by government and is focused on the issues of national security, health, and safety. Most technological improvements are created by and for developed countries, shaped by governments' dual desire to control and to monitor their citizens. Those are pretty interesting predictions made by the Rockefeller Foundation, but more interesting is that Bill Gates doesn't address or explain how these people who are concerned about microchips and biometric tracking, he doesn't address how they are misinterpreting these reports. Instead, he just acts like he has no idea where these microchip ideas came from. But most interesting of all to me is that the journalists pretend that they are asking him the tough questions, but then they allow him to get away with mocking and dismissing them as absurd instead of asking him those kinds of follow-up questions about where people got these ideas from in the first place. The other thing that Bill Gates just can't seem to understand is why people might think that he is profiting off of these vaccines. So there's a reporter on CBS who asks him about this in an interview, and she asks him whether or not it's fair that the taxpayers fund the vaccine research, and then the vaccine companies sell that product back to the government at taxpayers' expense for profit. So we're going to listen to how Bill Gates answers this question, and then we're going to talk about how we know that he is lying through his teeth when he says it.
I want to ask you about today, the government support, taxpayer money that's going towards vaccine development. Today, we learned Pfizer is going to get nearly $2 billion, Moderna receiving $438 million in taxpayer money. And yet both companies have said they will not sell the vaccine at cost. They're going to make a profit on it. Should pharmaceutical companies profit off this vaccine research that taxpayers have helped fund?
AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson have said they're going to use a nonprofit construct. You know, the exact contracts that were negotiated, I don't have access to. But yes, you'd want to balance the fact who's taking the risk and who gets the benefit of those things.
I mean, we heard from the HHS secretary say today that the vaccine will be free for Americans, or affordable. So that means the government will help purchase it from companies that are making a profit off of that we helped fund the research for.
So Bill Gates says that you have to balance the risk versus the reward. But I'm wondering what the risk is for these vaccine companies that entitles them to billions of dollars of reward, because they can't be sued if anything goes wrong. So the people who are taking the risk in this scenario would be the people who are taking the vaccine that hasn't been tested yet, and the people who are paying for it. The vaccine company has no risk. They're not liable. All they get is the huge profits. Bill Gates also says that he has no knowledge of the details of these vaccine contracts that they have made, but reporting by KHN actually says differently. Oxford University surprised and pleased advocates of overhauling the vaccine business in April by promising to donate the rights of its product for coronavirus vaccine to any drug maker. A few weeks later, Oxford, urged on by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, reversed course. It signed an exclusive vaccine deal with AstraZeneca that gave the pharmaceutical giant sole rights and no guarantee of low prices, with the less publicized potential for Oxford to eventually make millions from the deal and win plenty of prestige. So Mr. Philanthropist discouraged the vaccine companies from giving away rights to the vaccine for free, which would provide more access to people, and instead advised them on how to turn a profit off of these deals. Now we're going to watch another clip where Bill Gates says that the top priority of his foundation is to promote vaccine access. He was also asked who will get the vax first, and I just wonder why this unelected guy who has zero qualifications other than having a lot of money has any say in that matter at all.
I mean, you're talking about a global vaccination program without a vaccine that hasn't been fully developed yet. But who's going to get the vaccine first?
That's in discussion. We want to make sure that we don't have people dying just because they can't afford to have access to the vaccine. And so that speaks to the top priority of our foundation. And
so again, he's lying when he says that, because Salon reports that Bill Gates said no to sharing the vaccine formula with the global poor to end the pandemic. And here is the interview from Sky News that this headline was referring to. And you'll notice that he starts by talking about how the number of vaccines that's being produced is great because they were able to open up new factories all over the world and enhance their production output. But then he gets asked why he won't allow the vaccine formulas to be shared. And he pivots so hard that I actually got whiplash the first time that I watched this. And he immediately says that he can't share this vaccine formula, which would cut into his profits, because it's not like you can just open up vaccine factories anywhere in the world, which is the exact opposite of the thing that he was bragging about doing in the first part of the interview.
The vaccine space is been amazing. Not only did we get them very rapidly, now the volumes are getting up, and we're using factories in India and other places as a second source. So we're not just relying on the company that invented the vaccine, but for the first time ever, transferring exactly that vaccine into factories like at Serum or BioE to get the capacity up so that, we want to vaccinate certainly all the elderly in the world, and in most countries, we want to get to over 80% vaccination. And so that's, kind of mind-blowing, particularly when we did very little to prepare in advance.
And in terms of that, there's been some speculation that the changing intellectual property rules and allowing these vaccines, as you say, the recipe for these vaccines to be shared would be helpful. Do you think that would be helpful?
No.
Why not?
Well, there's only so many vaccine factories in the world, and people are very serious about the safety of vaccines. And so moving something that had never been done, moving a vaccine from, say, a J&J factory into a factory in India, that it's novel. It's only because of our grants and our expertise that can happen at all. The thing that's holding things back in this case is not intellectual property. There's not like some idle vaccine factory with regulatory approval that makes magically safe vaccines. You've got to do the trials on these things, and every manufacturing process has to be looked at in a very careful way.
Now I want to tell you guys a story of how Bill Gates got on my radar in the first place. It all just started with this dumb Facebook argument. I saw two people fighting with each other in the comment section when I was at home out of work on quarantine last year. One of the girls was saying that Bill Gates had said that he wanted to use vaccines to reduce the population. And the other girl, she was taking the side of Bill Gates and just kept saying that, that's not true. Where did you hear that? You made that up. And since I had a little free time and didn't really care about Bill Gates, but just thought I'd stir the pot between these two, I decided to look it up and see if I could figure out what this girl was talking about, because I had never heard those allegations about Bill Gates before. And so what I was able to find was this video clip of Bill Gates's TED Talk on how to reduce carbon emissions. And this is the thing that got the entire Bill Gates ball rolling for me. So if you ever think you're wasting your time by arguing about stuff on social media, I will say you might not convince the person that you are actually debating or fighting with, but there might be an open-minded person who's scrolling through Facebook during their AM/PM and happens to come across your comment, and you never know that maybe you might change their mind. So don't hesitate to put the truth out there. I can speak for myself. It's not a fruitless exercise. So we're going to watch the relevant portion from this carbon emissions TED Talk so everybody can hear for themselves what Bill Gates says about vaccines in relation to the population. And then we'll discuss afterwards whether or not what he says makes sense.
This equation has four factors, a little bit of multiplication. So you've got a thing on the left, CO2, that you want to get to zero. And that's going to be based on the number of people, the services each person's using on average, the energy on average for each service, and the CO2 being put out per unit of energy. So let's look at each one of these and see how we can get this down to zero. Probably one of these numbers is going to have to get pretty near to zero. That's back from high school algebra. But let's take a look. First, we've got population. The world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%.
When I hear that, the question that comes to my mind is that given that vaccines are designed to prevent people from dying from communicable diseases, how does doing a really good job with vaccines do anything to reduce the population? Why would that have been said? Did he misspeak when he said that? Because that doesn't make sense. Vaccines make less people die, so that would increase the population. I shared this in the Facebook comment section. There's a lot of articles and fact checks that you can read about it, but the one I was sent at the time was from Snopes. And all the fact check articles essentially say the same thing, but the Snopes one is my favorite. So let's read what the counter argument is to this claim about what Bill Gates just said, and then we'll see if that makes sense. Okay. So here's the truth according to Snopes. Did Bill Gates admit vaccinations are designed so governments can depopulate the world? This is rated as false. As discussed in a November 21st, 2011 Forbes cover profiling the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, reducing population growth has always been integral to their stated mission of improving people's health and giving them the chance to lift themselves out of hunger and poverty. In 1997, when he and Melinda first ventured into public health, they focused on birth control, funding a Johns Hopkins effort to use computers to help them in developing world learn about contraception. The logic was crisp and Gates-friendly. Health, resources, people. Since resources, as Gates noted, is relatively fixed, the answer lay in population control. As further discussed in this piece, Gates later came to the conclusion that birth control was not the best approach to achieve the goal of slowing the population. Instead, realizing that counterintuitively, a reduction in child mortality was the best way to limit population growth. Which again doesn't make sense. If you are reducing the rate of children that are dying, how does that reduce the population? That would increase the population, is what you would think. But let's keep going and see what he says. In society after society, he saw when the mortality rate falls, specifically below 10 deaths per 1,000 people, the birth rate follows, and population growth stabilizes. It goes against common sense, Bill Gates says. Most parents don't choose to have 8 children because they want to have big families, but because they know how many of their children will die. That does not make any sense to me. How does Bill Gates know the individual reasons for why people choose to have large families? There's all kinds of reasons, religious reasons. What on earth are they talking about? Even they admit that it goes against common sense. Is there any evidence to support this conclusion other than the fact that Bill and Melinda Gates are saying, but that's what it is? Because on paper, it makes no sense. And it also I don't even see how it addresses the problem of population growth. Let's assume that what he is saying is true, that families will have less children if they have a high confidence that those children will live to adulthood. So say you have 10 children because infant mortality rate is high, and you know that only 2 of them are going to live to adulthood. So you're hedging your bets, you have 10, 2 are going to survive. You have contributed to a temporary spike in the population, but you have not contributed to the long-term population growth. The way the population grows is exponentially. You have to live to adulthood and then have more children who then they go on to have more and more children, and it just keeps branching out. So it would be the same contribution as if you only had 2 kids anyways because you had a high confidence that they were going to live. you still only are contributing 2 people that are going to contribute to the larger population growth when they become adults. I see no reason how Bill Gates knows that what he is saying here is true. I see nothing to back it up. But also, taking him at his word, I still don't understand how that makes sense. But let's continue on with more Snopes. See if they answer this question for us. This is a point Gates has made repeatedly, and his views were clearly articulated in the 2009 Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation annual letter. A surprising but critical fact we learned was reducing the number of deaths actually reduces population growth. In fact, parents choose to have enough kids to give them a high chance that several will survive and support them as they grow old. But as the number of kids who survive to adulthood goes up, parents can achieve this goal without having as many children. In other words, Gates is not interested in using vaccines to reduce the population by using them as an agent of death or a tool to sterilize unsuspecting masses. Rather, Gates is interested in keeping more children alive in order to reduce the need for parents to have more children, thus limiting the overall population growth. As evidenced in a 2014 paper published in Science that attempted to calculate future population growth, not everyone is convinced child mortality is the smoking gun to quell population growth. But Gates' views on child mortality contribution to population growth is increasingly discussed in the scientific literature and is still subject to debate. What is not up to debate are the intentions of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation with regard to vaccines and population growth as articulated by Bill and Melinda Gates in their foundation's 2017 annual letter. If parents believe their children will survive, and if they have the power to time and space their pregnancies, they choose to have fewer children. But when a mother can choose how many children to have, her children are healthier, they're better nourished, and their mental capacities are higher. And parents have more time and money to spend on each child's health and schooling, and that's how families, countries get out of poverty. This is obviously a far cry from, as your newswire.com put it, having Bill Gates tell us how we all must consent to kill the human strategy to save the planet from the carbon dioxide we make. So the only evidence used in that fact check to debunk any of these claims were we asked Bill and Melinda Gates if they were going to use vaccines for depopulation, like he said they were going to in the TED Talk, and Bill and Melinda Gates have said no. And they have this really ridiculous theory about how vaccinating children to prevent them from dying actually lowers the birth rate. And the only people that have ever said that are Bill and Melinda Gates, but they said it a bunch of times, so that makes it true. And by the way, it's pretty disputed in the science journals, but Bill and Melinda Gates have said it, so we have to believe them, because there's no way that a foundation would ever lie about their motivations to protect themselves from public scrutiny. That's the fact check. So thank you, Snopes, for explaining that. I was even willing to give Bill Gates the benefit of the doubt that maybe his defense would have been that he misspoke and didn't mean to include vaccines and was meaning to talk about birth control and other healthcare options. But he didn't do that. He doubled down on it and said, yeah, vaccines help reduce the population somehow. To me, if you want to reduce the population through the use of a vaccine, the only 2 ways to do that are either to euthanize people with it or sterilize them so they can't grow up to have children and contribute to the population growth. So that leads us to these allegations of what his foundation was up to in India. Reported on here in The Diplomat, why are Indians so angry at Bill Gates? The latest backlash against the Gates Foundation in India is the result of years' worth of concerns raised by human rights activists and civil society. The vaccination program dependent on these Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation grantees has been criticized in India due to its inaccessibility, profiteering, and encouragement of free market policies for life-saving vaccines. Despite funding from the foundation and even the Indian government, the private vaccine manufacturers are making high profit margins in India's vaccine market. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has also been put under the scanner by previous central government led by the INC. In 2013, India's Parliamentary Standing Committee on Health and Family Welfare, comprising of members across political lines, held the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation funded program for appropriate technology in health, which is called PATH, guilty of violating regulatory and ethical norms laid down by the Indian and U.S. governments for clinical trials. The committee investigated the role of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and PATH in the trial of HPV vaccines on children in this Indian district, during which 7 children died. Although the government did not find any connection to the vaccines in deaths, it did uncover ethical failings in the subsequent investigation. The government of India responded by restricting the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation from the country's immunization program. For the sake of investigating, I looked up The Diplomat on a media bias rating website, and they were rated as least biased because they have straightforward news reporting and minimal left to right bias editorially. They are rated high for factual reporting due to excellent sourcing of information and a clean fact check record. So, seems like a pretty legit source to me, but if it is not good enough for you, the story is also covered in the Indian Journal of Medical Ethics. So in July 2010, there is a blurb titled Deaths in Trial of HPV Vaccine. The deaths of girls who are part of an HPV vaccine trial has raised alarm about the nature of research in India, as well as the value attached by the state to the lives of its citizens. The trial was conducted in this town in India by PATH with support from Indian Council of Medical Research and local health authorities. They were funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. When the government stopped the trials, 3 doses had already been administered to 30,000 participants, mostly tribal girls ages between 9 and 14. The Union Health Minister has denied that the deaths have anything to do with the trials, and as things stand, there is no conclusive evidence of a causal link between the vaccine and the deaths. But the fact that the girls were part of a trial is reason enough to warrant further investigations. An investigation into one of the sites, coordinated by the Women's Health Group, SAMA, revealed that the trials recruited tribal girls from poor areas. These girls were malnourished. To worsen the situation, consent forms for the trial were in English, which even the healthcare provider administering the vaccine to them may not have been able to read, let alone these young participants. So now let's look at how the American media fact checks and debunks these claims that I just told you. Reuters says this is a false claim. Bill Gates faces trial in India for testing vaccines on children. So again, they pigeonholed the claim into just the fact that he is facing trial over this. A spokesperson for the Gates Foundation confirmed to Reuters via email that the allegations in the claim are false. There is no pending lawsuit against Gates or his foundation in relation to this. The vaccine trial in question was not illegal, though it was later halted and has been the source of controversy in India. So Reuters debunks this by calling the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and asking them if it's true. So now it's going to go on to tell you about the study and cite this scientific magazine article saying that the investigation showed these girls died for unrelated reasons. The claims refer to the HPV vaccine study conducted by the U.S. nonprofit organization PATH. The study, which was financed by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, was canceled in 2010 after local media reported the death of 7 girls taking part. Science magazine reported that the investigations carried out by a committee designed by the Indian government later determined the deaths were unrelated to the vaccine demonstration. 5 were evidently unrelated to the vaccine. 1 girl drowned in a quarry, another died from a snake bite, 2 committed suicide, and 1 died from complications of malaria. The causes of death for the other 2 girls were uncertain. On August 29, 2013, the Indian Parliament Standing Committee on Health and Family Welfare reported the vaccination trial by PATH committed several irregularities, including a gross violation of consent and legal requirement of consent. After the report was released, PATH said that they strongly disagree with the findings, conclusions, and tone of the released report and its disregard of the evidence and facts. So, yes, it does mention these ethical violations here in the fact check, but because PATH strongly disagrees with the tone of them, yet provides no other argument to back themselves up other than, Reuters rates this claim as false based on the technicality that he is not facing trial currently in 2020 for something that happened in 2010. It's not even rated as partially true or missing context to give you more information about it. It just tells you that it's false. But let's read this Science magazine report that Reuters cites in their fact check for ourselves and see what it actually says, because Reuters left out a few key parts of that article. In another sharp blow for researchers hoping to conduct clinical trials in India, a parliamentary panel has excoriated a U.S. nonprofit and its Indian partner for alleged ethical violations in a trial of a vaccine to protect against cervical cancer caused by HPV. The panel's report will have a freezing effect on all clinical research. A vaccine against the virus has been available in the United States since 2006. Hoping to broaden the vaccine's use in the developing world, PATH, funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, started an HPV trial in 24,777 adolescent girls in India. But several months into the trial, the government pulled the plug after news outlets reported the deaths of the 7 girls. So now we have the paragraph that Reuters quotes in their fact check about how these girls all died for other unrelated reasons. But the one sentence of this paragraph that they don't quote here is the last one, where it says, other experts say that in the absence of autopsies, it's impossible to pinpoint the actual cause of death. Probing deeper, a panel appointed by the Indian Health Ministry in 2010 uncovered a number of shortcomings and alleged ethical lapses in the vaccine trial. Its report in 2011 noted that the trial on several occasions failed to obtain proper informed consent of participants. It also revealed that trial managers did not set up a mechanism for reporting any adverse effects, and it criticized the lack of a control group and the trial's inclusion of girls from India's protected tribal communities without gaining individual consent. An August 30th report blasts PATH for failing to have conducted post-mortem examinations of the girls who died during the trial. It levels an astonishing allegation. Rather than endeavoring to protect women's health, PATH, it charged, was a willing tool of a foreign drug companies hoping to convince the Indian government to include the HPV vaccine in its universal vaccine program, a roster of mandatory immunizations that the government is required to pay for. This is an obvious case where Indians were being used as guinea pigs, contends the editor of the National Medical Journal of India. In a statement, PATH said, "We strongly disagree with the findings and conclusions and the tone of this report and its disregard of the evidence and facts. Still, the fallout from the parliamentary panel's report could be severe. After this episode, it will be harder to do clinical trials in India. All eyes are now on the Supreme Court, which on the 26th of September will resume hearings on a case broadly looking at clinical trials in India. In July, the court's 2-judge bench observed that while foreign companies are treating India as a haven for clinical trials, it is proving hell for India." So, yes, Bill Gates was not on trial for this, but he was using poor Indian girls in vaccine trials that were so littered with ethical violations that the Indian Supreme Court barred his foundation and any others from doing research in India. And it is my understanding that India has a new president now, and the Gates Foundation has been allowed to resume activities there in some capacity. But just one other question that I have about these vaccine trials in third world countries with Bill Gates is, why does he need to personally be administering these vaccines to these children? What is that about? As we've said a couple times, he has no medical degree. If I become super rich someday and I decide to donate a bunch of money to cancer research, does that entitle me to go around and administer chemo to people? Because I wouldn't think that it would. So I don't understand why Bill Gates is allowed to be personally injecting these children with vaccines. And I really don't understand why he would want to. That's crazy to me. I want to watch a couple more clips from that Bill Gates interview on CBS. And the first one I want to show you is Bill Gates talking about how he doesn't even know if these vaccines are going to work or not.
We don't know if these vaccines will work. We don't know if they'll work to avoid deaths. We don't know if they'll work to avoid transmission. That's why we're working on so many first-generation vaccines and a whole bunch of second-generation vaccines that, although they'll take more time, they are more likely to be extremely effective.
So why are we shaming and ostracizing people from society because they are skeptical about this when Bill Gates, the man in charge, was skeptical about this? He says that there's going to be a second generation of safer, more effective vaccines after we get this first initial trial out of the way. So what is so wrong with people who just want to wait and see how this goes and be a part of that second generation of vaccines? The second clip I want to show you is Bill Gates talking about what makes a good vaccine.
When will we know? How do we know if these vaccines are working?
Well, there's three things you'd like from a vaccine. You'd like it to be very safe in all the populations that you indicate it for, no side effects. You'd like it to block transmission, and you'd like it to avoid the individual who gets the vaccine getting sick. The FDA is being pressured to allow what's called just a correlate approval. Fortunately, they've held the line on that.
Of the three benchmarks that Bill Gates just listed, the COVID vaccine is 0 for 3. He says we want there to be no side effects, which there are some, and we're actually going to, in the next clip, Bill Gates is going to talk about some of them. He also says that it wants to block transmission and stop the vaccinated person from getting sick, and this vaccine does neither of those two things. You can still transmit it to people even if you've been vaccinated, and you can still get sick, albeit they say it's less severe, but you're still getting sick. So we've hit 0 for 3 on Bill Gates' benchmarks, yet we are still pushing forward with mandating this at risk of losing your job and your livelihood. But where I get confused now is at the end of that clip, Bill Gates says that the FDA is being pressured, but they're doing a good job of holding the line against that pressure. So in this next clip, though, he is going to now say that the FDA is not being pressured.
Are these vaccines safe?
Well, the FDA not being pressured will look hard at that. The FDA is the gold standard of regulators, and their current guidance on this, if they stick with that, is very, very appropriate. And you know, the side effects were not super severe. That is, it didn't cause permanent health problems.
But the data showed that everybody with a high dose had a side effect.
Yeah, but some of that is not dramatic, where, you know, it's just, you know, super painful. But yes, we need to make sure there's not severe side effects. The FDA, I think, will do a good job of that, despite the pressure.
First says the FDA is being pressured, but they're holding the line. Then says that the FDA is not going to be pressured, and then goes back to saying that, yeah, they're being pressured. So nobody accused Bill Gates of pressuring the FDA, but the fact that he keeps bringing it up and talking about it and denying it when he wasn't accused of it is what now makes me start to wonder if he's pressuring the FDA. Why else are you denying something that you're not accused of? It's like the telltale heart. He's just accidentally told on himself. So I have more to say about Bill Gates than I thought that I did, and this video is getting a little long, so I am going to do just a separate, shorter episode about the other weird Bill Gates thing, which is Event 201. In case anybody is interested in that, there will be a whole separate video just for that topic. Before I close out this one, I want to just show one more Bill Gates interview to relate this back to a previous episode where we talked about Bill Gates' moral character and his friendship that he had with Jeffrey Epstein. Because Bill Gates, of all of these high power people that were in Jeffrey Epstein's orbit, the only one that I am aware of that sought out his friendship after he got out of jail for being a convicted sex offender in 2010, that is when Bill Gates went and sought out his friendship after the fact. So he gets asked about this on PBS's NewsHour, and I will say it is not as funny as Prince Andrew's denial, only because Bill Gates doesn't really say anything at all. But it is as equally as guilty, in my opinion.
That you had a number of meetings with Jeffrey Epstein, who, when you met him 10 years ago, he was convicted of soliciting prostitution from minors. What did you know about him when you were meeting with him, as you've said yourself, in the hopes of raising money?
I had dinners with him. I regret doing that. He had relationships with people he said, would give to global health, which is a interest I have. Not nearly enough philanthropy goes in that direction. Those meetings were a mistake. They didn't result in what he purported, and I cut them off. That goes back a long time ago now. So there's nothing new on that.
It was reported that you continued to meet with him over several years, and that, in other words, a number of meetings. What did you do when you found out about his background?
Well, I've said I regretted having those dinners, and there's absolutely nothing new on that.
Is there a lesson for you, for anyone else looking at this?
Well, he's dead, so in general, you always have to be careful. I'm very proud of what we've done in philanthropy. Very proud of the work of the foundation.
So Bill Gates is the richest or second richest person in the world, and he has to have dinners with a convicted sex offender to get money for global health. People go to Bill Gates to raise money for things. Bill Gates is the one that has the money. He doesn't need to go ask other people for money. But even if he did, he admits in that interview that he wasn't getting the money from Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein was facilitating the connections. And I would think that Bill Gates would have enough clout that he could contact those people directly or through one of his representatives, and he wouldn't need to use a convicted sex offender as the middleman for those deals. So that is why I am incredibly skeptical of this man, his motivations, and whether or not his foundation is actually doing the good works that they say that they do on paper, or if that is all just their cover story to really partner up with a lot of these government entities and other corrupt charities that have histories that tie back to the eugenics movement in Nazi Germany that they were never held accountable for. So I don't know if that is true. I am not sure if the plot is to be government control or if it is to reduce the population. I don't have the answer to it, but it concerns me that there are so many leads to go down these routes, and there doesn't really seem to be any honest journalists that are willing to ask those kinds of tough questions. You can call me a conspiracy theorist if you like, but the dangers and the potential where I can see that is heading, if it is something like a tracking device, would not be so ridiculous like, oh, Bill Gates wants to know, whether or not I'm going to target. Most people will probably go their entire lives never being important enough to get on the government's radar where they would ever care to look at who you are and what you're doing or your bank account information. But if you do happen to be one of the handful of people like a Julian Assange or Edward Snowden, or even one of those regular women who had the unfortunate circumstances of crossing paths with Bill Clinton back in Arkansas, if you just through happenstance in your life come across information that is damaging to the powers that be, and you decide that you want to take action and do something about it, then you become the target, and then they have pretty much any information they want to know on you, and they can use it against you. And history has shown that that is exactly what they do. So, no, I am not worried about the government wanting to know where I shop, where I spend my money, but I am concerned about the potentials for the level of control that we could give them over our lives if it turns out they really are bad actors. So that's the end of this episode of Genuine Questions. I appreciate you guys watching. And like I said, I'll be making that next episode just a mini episode about Event 201 in case anybody is interested in hearing a little bit more about Bill Gates's shady behavior.